But do I look like a sex murderer to you? Can you imagine me creeping around London, strangling all those women with ties? That's ridiculous. For a starter, in the O2.
Hey, what a zinger. Is it just me, or is it really just like a bad line to say to anybody, do I look like a sex murderer to you?
I thought he was going to say sex maniac because they kept saying that in the movie. Which I was just like, well, that's a weird term. We don't use that anymore, do we?
No, very antiquated. What a mess.
Hello, welcome to Film Trace. This is a podcast where we trace the life of a film from conception to production, all the way to its release and reception. It is the final episode of our Existential Thriller cycle. Chris, what do we have to say about that? This has been a fun one.
Yes, what a ride. We are wrapping this cycle up. And similar to when we wrapped up our previous cycle, which was our first in the reboot, requeling of Film Trace, if you will, the self-aware horror subgenre. And I say it feels similar because I feel like we've kind of done the Ouroboros, like the snake eating its tail.
Yes.
Just like we did when we delved into postmodernism and talked about, we began that cycle with the reboot of Scream, and then ended with Last House on the Left, the original Wes Craven. So we started and ended with Wes Craven, both whether it be like in spirit, the schlocky adaptation of his previous work, and then ending with, where pretty much that all started. And I didn't think we were going to do that this time around, but we ended up doing that. I don't know if you felt all the Men vibes, 2022 Alex Garland Men, while watching the main film for our cycle finale here, Alfred Hitchcock's Frenzy. Did you see those parallels, or was that just me looking for some kind of parallelism?
No, I think I didn't necessarily Men, but I think to what you're talking about, like it feels like we're swimming up the river or something. Like we're going to where this all sort of started. And yeah, now that you say that, there's tons of parallels with Men. But there's something about like going back to Hitchcock. I mean, he almost like invented the thriller, right? I mean, some people say that. And it is so odd going back to the 70s, early 70s in this case, and kind of uncovering what a thriller was back then. And I think in this case with Frenzy, it was even out of place back then as sort of being more stark, more sort of almost documentary-like, right? It's just a very dark, anxious movie that definitely has a lot of parallels to today. It was kind of like startling, the tone of this. Did you find that to be the case?
Oh, totally. Well, we should probably start, right? What the heck is Frenzy about?
Frenzy, yeah.
And how does it, what are our personal histories with it? Because this was a rewatch for me.
This is a rewatch?
Yes.
Oh, okay, cool.
But let's start with the IMDb synopsis, which in true IMDb fashion is kind of a mess, but not all that inaccurate compared to some of their other more tragic synopses. It says, a serial murderer is strangling women with a necktie. The London police have a suspect, but he is the wrong man. London is terrorized by a vicious sex killer known as the necktie murderer. So there's the redundancy, classic IMDb. Following the brutal slaying of his ex-wife down on his luck, Richard Blaney is suspected by the police of being the killer. Once again, this is the innocent man on the run, which is kind of surprising. Excuse me. Why did that make me sneeze? We hadn't had a wrong man accused movie in our cycle so far, even including some of the chaser films. I guess
think you're right.
The Hunt is the only exception.
Yeah,
and that's
The Hunt, yeah.
That's like
but that was different. That was sort of like Yeah, that was more like a fable type thing about group.
Exactly.
And this is like very straightforward, innocent man,
pure
not being
genre
framed.
stuff.
Well, I guess he is kind of framed at the end there. But yeah, innocent man on the run, essentially. Let's talk about our Hitchcock, man. Like I feel like you're going to have a way longer and deeper history with him than I do. So tell me about your love, hatred, respect. What do you think?
I mean, I was pretty classic by the book Hitchcock obsessive in high school. Saw Psycho, Vertigo, and North by Northwest. That was kind of like the trifecta where I was just like, oh yeah, old movies can be awesome. And I think actually my entry point might have been, sad to say, but it might have been the remake, shot for shot by Gus Van Sant in 1998 of Psycho. Such a mess. But, it was fascinating enough to me, like starting to be a burgeoning film history nerd and then wanting to go back. And I, borrowed the original Psycho from the library. And then Vertigo also had a modern connection. Terry Gilliam's 12 Monkeys with Bruce Willis has a very strong thread about Vertigo, and there's a lot of echoes and influence of Vertigo on 12 Monkeys, and so then that led me there, and the rest is history, as they say. And I think I at least attempted to watch most, if I don't think I got through every single Hitchcock film, but between high school and college, that was kind of like a passion project of mine, is getting through his whole filmography. And it probably wasn't until I started being a little more aware. I'd say probably not until I was in my mid to late 20s of like the more problematic side of the auteur. And I think that was around the time when Tippi Hedren started making comments to the press about her treatment during the filming of The Birds, which I never really cared for, but also during Marnie, which is a favorite of mine of his. And there were, you go back and you rewatch Hitchcock and it becomes pretty apparent, his pretty questionable view of like the female form on screen. And then how do you reconcile that with just like his, objectively revolutionary artistry when it comes to suspense and deep focus, and how he kind of not just revolutionized the genre, but also revolutionized the medium along with Orson Welles and maybe, 2 or 3 other names that people can spat off. But it was really hard having, gone through that. And I kind of stayed away from Hitchcock for a while, though I still always, I think you can still do a pretty easy breakdown of why, any given sequence in especially Vertigo or Psycho is a masterclass of being able to teach suspense in my high school film studies class. And so rewatching Frenzy for the first time, probably since I was 20 or so, a very different watch. And I did not feel great during much of any of it.
Ooh, yeah.
How about you?
I have a weird history with him because I distinctly remember going to, I didn't really grow up with him at all as like a kid or a teenager, but I remember going to Universal Studios when I was like 17. And like, there's a very distinct Hitchcock kind of not section of the entire place, and like the Psycho house is there, or replica, whatever, and they walk you through how the shower scene was shot and actually produced, and it was, cool. I was like floored by the whole thing as like a teenager. So like that was, and they did a lot with the birds too, and how they did a lot of those special effects. So I was like really into that part of it, but I never really got into his films. And like, I've seen Rear Window, I've seen Dial M for Murder very recently, doing a kind of noir rewatch, Vertigo, Psycho, but that's kind of it. So I'm not well versed in him at all.
Okay.
The odd thing about me too is that I remember his TV show stuff, Hitchcock Presents, more than I do his movies. Actually, I remember growing up with that. And seeing that, like, in my grandparents' house, we would watch that, and I was super fascinated by those little vignettes that he would do. and his sort of presentation on screen. To me, he was always more of like a celebrity in kind of my mind and how I saw him. And I didn't really dive into his filmography all that much until recently. And, he's got a certain style to him and showmanship that, it's a little bit like Dal M for Murder when I was watching that. And I was comparing that to a lot of noirs that I was watching of this similar time period. And I was like, oh, this is completely different. Like, this is very, now it would be like paint by numbers, but back then it was super innovative. But watching it now, it's like, oh, like I can follow everything that's going on here. There's not a lot of I didn't feel there was a huge like undercurrent of like social criticism or anything else going on. It was like a super well made thriller. And that's kind of how he's approached his work. So Frenzy was, a little bit of a different watch for me too, because I'd never seen it before and I don't really have a deep background in Hitchcock. So yeah, it was an interesting experience. And knowing that it was his penultimate film, right? I think he did one more after this. And so kind of the end of his career, a lot of people thought he was sort of fading, after Psycho. Marnie wasn't, experimental and didn't do very well. But this one was kind of seen as a comeback for him. And it did quite well, and people were, were happy with results. It kind of felt like it was kind of his swan song. What else? I mean, what do we want to dive into here about this? What is this? How did this movie come to be?
Yeah, so it's interesting that it was kind of called his quote return to form, because it's arguably way nastier than pretty much anything he ever did before. Obviously, it's 70s. Phrases like Hitchcock Unleashed were plastered all over the press, and it kind of became a constant sticking point, to the point where he's always been kind of what's the word, confrontational when it comes to press interviews, especially later in his career. At least that's the stuff that you can largely find on YouTube, right? But he was especially kind of crude, and arguably it's also because in the midst of filming, his wife and longtime collaborator, Alma Hitchcock, had a stroke or heart attack. There's some conflicting reports about that, but it just felt like this was him being like not just nasty in terms of like style, but also in terms of just like attitude, because he has a very explicit rape scene.
Yes, yeah.
It's the 70s, but it's still pretty explicit. Like, it's the year after Clockwork Orange, and it's not much tamer than that. No. And it is also, uses some harsher language than he could probably more commonly get away from or get away with in previous years, and nudity, and wrap that all together with the fact that this is his first time coming back to London in a while, since he had moved to Hollywood for a number of years. But in terms of like just the story and where it came from, that's where it's just kind of pedestrian. Like, he had gotten to the point later in his career where he was essentially just fine with being a hired hand. Like, he wouldn't have that much say in like shaping the story. He still had so much say behind the camera and when it came to casting and what have you, but he would just kind of like take anything that was mildly entertaining or interesting. And that's what he did here. It's from a book with a terrible title called I don't even think I wrote it down because it's long and dumb. Something about like Hello Leicester Square or something, and then there's another half of it. Anyways, that's by this random guy named Arthur LeBurn, and but he wants somebody to adapt it, so he has screenwriter Anthony Schaffer, who we actually mentioned earlier in this cycle because he was behind the script for Death Trap 10 years later in 82. And Hitchcock was quoted in the press at the time saying that, it was just something that came across his desk, and LeBurn was ready to write the script himself based off of his novel, but he Hitchcock felt very strongly. He said, a man who writes a book, that's one medium, but the motion picture is another entirely, and we shouldn't try to ask one man to be a master of two different mediums, which is almost hypocritical because Anthony Shaffer was known more as a playwright, as we talked about during the Chaser bit regarding Death Trap. So it just kind of feels like, on the one hand, he is kind of letting his id go wild, but at the same time, he isn't really putting a lot of care and effort into the conception of this film.
No, I think it seems like there's like a little documentary on this movie on YouTube, and I watched a bit of it, and it just seemed, you could see him filming the scenes, and he kind of seems checked out to me. I don't know if that was like his filming style or like how he handled the set, because every director is different. And then when Alma had the stroke or heart attack, he left for a while, and so other people had to take over for certain shots. So it's not all him. Some of it is probably who would be doing that, assistant director or something like that.
Right.
So it comes across as, and I've seen Psycho, I've seen Rear Window. This is obviously not in that echelon, right? It's not there.
Correct.
It's very. I will say this though, was obviously so technically brilliant with filmmaking. Obviously, one of the best filmmakers who's ever lived. That despite the fact that this story seems kind of a little bit mundane, although he is going back to. I think his first breakout film was like The Lodger, which is about Jack the Ripper.
Yep.
So, he's going back to the sort of serial killer in London. He's going back to where he grew up. It seems like he's very comfortable there. So there's an ease with which the film and the story kind of play out. But technically, I think it's way more fascinating than the content. The content doesn't really, I didn't find it very fascinating at all. But there's certain sequences like the murder of the main character's girlfriend, where we don't see it off screen, right? Or we don't see it on screen.
The tracking shot away from.
Yeah, it pulls the camera down. I mean, that's amazing. Like, so clearly,
he was on set that day, I think.
I would. Yeah, that's definitely him doing his thing. And he even talks about how the cool thing about Hitchcock too is he loved talking about filmmaking. Mm-hmm. So there's just endless amounts of interviews with him about his philosophy and why he did this and why he did that. And he talks about that scene specifically. And so when I'm watching it and sitting through it, and I think if you have a better Hitchcock vocabulary and history with him, it's going to be way more enjoyable. But I don't know. Do you find like the content here, going back to like the way it was written and that part of it, did you find it compelling?
No, I didn't, and I was disappointed because I remember from my like dig into his filmography back when I was in college. In particular, I was getting through some of the latter works like Frenzy, where it was just like I kind of remember it being a minor effort, but I also had a distinct memory of it being something that was really. It picked apart a lot in my film classes at the University of Minnesota because of not necessarily what's readily accessible to the average viewer, but more so on that whole kind of like meta analysis of this guy who's near the end of his career, probably knows it, isn't really taking great care of himself and his own personal health, and he just kind of reveals, what he has hinted at for so many years regarding his feelings about women. And honestly, like, I don't think I fully made that connection to circle back to Alex Garland's Men, which began this cycle. But I think that's probably why I wanted to come back here, because it's amazing, really, how in this 50-year span of movies, the history of this medium, we've gone from such like one end of like this really dark and brutal kind of male gaze, this violent male gaze, and then it coming all the way around to a male filmmaker this here trying to kind of wrestle with that. And of course, your mileage may vary, not to relitigate our episode regarding
let's relitigate that.
Alex Garland, but it's just all out in the open now, right? Like, of course, there's still subtext and there's still so much to discuss and argue about, but I just felt really bad watching Frenzy, even though there were moments, like you said, with like the tracking shot pulling away.
Beautiful moments, yeah.
They're still in there, but it's just really hard to reconcile.
But what do you think that like Hitchcock would say about that? You know, like if you had asked him back then about Frenzy and about how the women are treated in the movie and all that sort of stuff, like I get the impression that he would be defensive about it, and he would say stuff like, oh, well, you know, it's part of the show business. You have to cast this type of woman. And he says he's such a fascinating guy because he'll go on about, and he said this about Frenzy and he said this about Psycho, where I'm going to show you violence. And in Frenzy, it's a very graphic violence against women, sexual violence, right? And then he pulls back completely and never shows you anything ever again.
Right.
And he does basically something similar in Psycho, where he wants to create a sensational moment that you won't forget, so that every time as the tension builds for the rest of the movie, you're going to feel in your mind something horrific happening. And like, you know, he would probably say, speaking specifically about the rape scene, it's like, I have to do that to get people kind of screw him up. That's what he wants to do. But the hard part there is, and to the counter to what he would have said, is that why are you using violence against women as a form of entertainment? Because I think that's the big thing to me. That would be his excuse. And he said it multiple times in interviews. Oh, it's, you know, it's about the thrill. It's about suspense. It's about getting a reaction out of the audience. And it's sort of, you know, and this is looping back to Last House on the Left, because Wes Craven sort of did the same thing there. Sexual violence, rape, murder, all of these things to get a reaction out of the crowd. I mean, do you feel like, is that some form of defense at all?
If there is like a way to twist your brain in knots to justify it, it's purely academic and intellectual, I feel. And it's still very much like a privileged male point of view. It's, I don't know, the thing that really sticks with me after doing some research, Cinephilia and Beyond has a great write-up of what made this production, like the actual like nuts and bolts of shooting this film, so different from his previous ones, which is that essentially, like, you could make the argument he wanted to go back to, like you said earlier, the London of his youth, because maybe he saw the writing on his wall, the end of his career, and he wanted to kind of return to that, whether it be nostalgia or trying to. He did this to the point not just of like the neighborhood he grew up with, but like Rusk, the killer in the film, is working at a fruit and vegetable stand. That's what his father literally did in that neighborhood growing up. Like, these kind of weird autobiographical Easter eggs are abundant, and it still feels like, okay, but then why this? And same thing with like the subversion of cliche. Okay, like style wise, genre wise, like very much like outsider view, like it's just so, it feels so gross to like put those two things together. Like the rapist murderer antagonist of my movie has the same occupation as my father, but then also like he wants to subvert the cliche of saving that really nasty, brutal rape for the end of the movie, instead puts it at the top, and then, like you said, pulls away just when the audience thinks he's going to, go all in. Staying so long in the potato truck to the point of like dark comedy of breaking the fingers. and like just like even the brutal misogyny of the quotidian English stereotypes and gender roles of like coming home to dinner, and the wife of the detective is making these kind of gruesome home cooked meals, which is on the one hand like just I laughed. Like it's kind of ridiculous.
I thought that was the best part of the film.
It is. I mean, that's one of the things that gives the movie some saving grace. Those kind of autobiographical details, because like as everybody knew, if there's one thing that Hitchcock loved more than movies and violence, it was food. And so like being able to fit that in there, but it's just like so there are those redeeming factors, but at the end of it, it's just, I mean, even right there with like the abrupt ending, like you said, of the sudden framing and then cut to the credits, it's it all feels really like this man is not well. Maybe that's part of the point of cinema.
I have a quote for you that this is an interview he did at I think NYU for this film cycle or whatever, PR, whatever you want to call it. Mm-hmm. He goes, explicit violence is never as good as people can make violence in their heads. In Psycho, I never show the knife touching the girl, for example. It's all suggested. In Frenzy, the new girl is dumped from the truck in a bikini of potatoes wired to her body, but the mind films in the nakedness. I never take a chance at offending anyone. That would spoil their enjoyment of my films. The rape scene in Frenzy feels pretty explicit to me, as much as you get away with in a mainstream movie, right?
Yeah.
That seems pretty offensive.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is like it feels like he's trying to have his cake and eat it too.
Oh, 100%. That's exactly what he's doing.
And it's like the world is pushing him forward, right? Because like I said earlier, the 70s has kind of busted wide open what film can be. I mean, that's when the argument starts getting presented in polite society about pornography versus cinema, right? And that gets delved into with Taxi Driver, but then also later on the Reagan years. And so it's just like it's very much a precursor to that, and it just feels like there's this overlap, and I'm sure he probably felt it too. I mean, how could you not, when you're the love of your life has a death scare, and you are a person known for like visually representing death on film. Like that's your job, that's your career. That's got to really fuck you up. And I think that kind of hypocrisy and self-hatred just is so readily apparent. And that's ultimately, I think, where the existentialism comes from. So many of the films, actually all of the films, I'd say until this one, have been about like the protagonist having some kind of existential crisis. And you could still argue that with this film, right? Like
to some degree, yeah.
I think one of the only interesting things about the story of the film is the fact that like Richard Blaney, the main character, is very much like not a likable person, and so he very much is going through this kind of crisis. Like he's clearly had a fall from grace. He's used to be in the military, but now he's a barman, and now he's a fired barman, and then he's been divorced, and like it just seems like everything makes sense. Like it's not like Richard Kimball, like in The Fugitive, right? A heroic, respected doctor that gets accused. Like this is a piece of shit that gets accused of doing something a piece of shit would do. And I if there's all those other autobiographical elements, I can't help but wonder like what drew Hitchcock to the source material, because it's not a very interesting story, but did he kind of resonate with that idea of like a piece of shit being accused of being a piece of shit, even though he's not that big of a piece of shit?
No, I mean, there's something here where it's sort of like he wants to come back to London, and like, he probably wasn't very excited about this, right?
Yeah.
There's no way he was. Like, you can tell in the way that it's shot and the way the story is done. There's just, it's very workmanlike all the way through.
Mhm.
Yes, there are flashes of phenomenal filmmaking without a doubt. But there's a reason why this film is not as sort of remembered fondly as his other classics, obviously.
Yeah.
You know, it's a minor. Would you call it a minor Hitchcock work, or kind of lesser
Yeah.
Hitchcock? I don't know what the term is for that.
No, I think
Beer T or tier B or whatever you want to call it.
right.
Yeah, the thing about it though too is that when you're talking about precursors here, that's where the film I think rises to a different level, and I think almost on an unconscious level for Hitchcock, because it is so, like you said, in a way insular and cut off from the world, and you can tell that there is a darkness in him that has not been vanquished, so to speak, or even necessarily dealt with, and you can feel that in the film. There is a sort of modern anxiety to the whole thing, and a weird sort of disassociation going on with the protagonist, and who are we following? We're following him, and then the killer, and then the police inspector. There is a weird sort of contemporary nature to the film that, looking back at it as a piece of film history, it's important from that aspect, right?
Yeah.
Because it is kind of a brick along the path towards the future of filmmaking. And obviously, like, why is that? Well, it's Hitchcock, a big name. It did decently well. It probably had a big splash in London, so there was a lot of cachet around the whole thing. So a lot of people saw the movie. But I do wonder, how indebted is something like Taxi Driver to this? I mean, what do you think? I'm like, what do you think the tentacles of this sort of anxiety and darkness that Hitchcock was showing on screen? It does feel very contemporary to me, all the way through, I would say, the 2000s, like the aughts. Nowadays, less so, but definitely through like a lot of the sort of sexual thrillers and stuff like that. That really dark period in the not necessarily the 90s, but I think the aughts specifically, where things are just kind of gross.
Yeah, well, I think,
I don't know,
like,
what do you think?
anything,
Is it related to all that?
absolutely. I mean, and that's part of the deal. Is like, it's growing pains in the genre, right? Is like we're trying to get from like a really kind of more innocuous and suggestive kind of thriller suspense film to something that is like outwardly nasty, but like not in a but still like done tastefully, like Fincher's Zodiac, maybe.
Yes.
And along the way, you happen upon a diamond like Silence of the Lambs in the early '90s, and yeah, there's a book all about Paul Schrader, the screenwriter of Taxi Driver, and obviously the filmmaker behind not necessarily a lot of thrillers, more dramas, but definitely existential movies like First Reformed and The Card Counter. George Cavaros was the writer of that book, and he points specifically to that tracking shot we've come back to a couple times in Frenzy. He says that sequence echoes the kind of tracking shots that Scorsese does in Taxi Driver. That's probably also at least somewhat scripted in Schrader's world depiction of New York City, which is a very different New York City than what had previously been, committed to celluloid. Even like the darker versions of New York throughout the years of, the golden age of Hollywood and what have you. Just kind of like what Frenzy's doing with London. He says that the camera's exit from the building seems to, quote, erase the crime. In Taxi Driver, there's this long, slow track back over the bodies, pools of blood, after Travis Bickle's massacre at the end of the film. And I mean, it's almost like, Hitchcock talks about how sometimes, he subverted a cliche so many times that it became a new cliche. And I think that's one of them, right? That it's like the British version is to pull away and not leave anything in view. And the more American way is to pull away, but then see all the dead bodies, right? So in that sense, like, there's enough redeeming factors in Frenzy to make a decent, at least, like I said earlier, academic intellectual argument. But I think what you see even though it's very well cast. That's another thing that's, one of the more unique things about Frenzy, especially in comparison to other Hitchcock movies, where like, Janet Leigh or Cary Grant would be a clear cast lead. Like this is also kind of early in the whole idea of auteurism, where you wouldn't just have a director's name on it, but you wouldn't also have like a star's name on it, right? This is pretty unknown actors, and both for the male and female characters, even though there's like this rampant misogyny, like they are some, especially for the women, I think, like some pretty interesting performances of these very stereotypical roles. There's a great write-up about how trying to reconcile, like the immaculate precision of the acting and the filmmaking with just the raw, just horrible sexism that's on screen. Mary Munoz of Jump Cut Online wrote, the women in the film fit firmly into three camps: the nag, the prude, or the good time gal. They're never fleshed out beyond this, and Hitchcock seems to reserve his most vicious rage for the first two, which is kind of interesting because he's, attempting to subvert a cliche just in general with the genre. But like, he could have easily, like, he changed a lot of things from the novel with Anthony Shaffer's help. He could have easily changed the rape part of it, the sex part of it, but he chose not to. And he, reserved the most graphic rape and murder for the nag, the second most brutal for the prude, and the off-screen one for the good time gal.
Yeah.
It's really unfortunate.
It's a minefield.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
But the one thing I will bring up too is that in trying to connect this to the broader sort of existential thriller cycle that we've been doing, it kind of reminds me a bit of when we did Last House on the Left, and then the Chaser film, was it Fearless Vampire Hunters?
Yes.
Right?
Roman Polanski. Yeah.
Yeah, Roman Polanski. And I remember when we had that discussion, we were sort of trying to figure out, hey, does this movie feel like it was a harbinger of things to come, or kind of a it stayed at the party too long type feeling, like a holdover from another period?
Mm-hmm.
Frenzy is strange in that I think a lot of it is a holdover from the 60s and 50s and 40s and the early part of his career, and just society in general. A lot of the anti-women, stereotypical stuff, patriarchy stuff is all throwback, because that stuff was the norm in movies. All of that, what you're talking about, the lack of representation, no woman has an actual sort of character beyond how they service men, all throwback. But what we talked about before, and sort of the anxiety, the darkness to it, the cynicism of it, the kind of lack in faith in humanity, seems like it's kind of pushing towards the future. So it is a very odd film, where there's a lot of juxtaposition going on, and I think that's one of the reasons why it's not viewed as like a greater film of Hitchcock, just because it's muddle as hell.
Right.
It feels like an old film with a lot of new ideas, but it just does not gel, I don't think, at all.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the reasons it feels so uncomfortable, right? Yeah. Not unlike why The Hunt, I think, feels so uncomfortable to watch in 2022, after Me Too, but still very much coming from like arguably a good place, telling, a different kind of story, trying to get people to understand nuance. And then like here with Frenzy, it's like almost the inverse, right? Like it doesn't want you to like, it doesn't want you to think about nuance. It just he wants to provoke, but at the same time, he is kind of just not, he seems to have very little concern with audience readings. He just kind of I don't know. It really feels like a weird last gasp.
Well, I think he's like a prankster playing a cruel joke.
Yeah, right? Yeah, totally.
And it's just like, there's an uncomfortable feeling to it. what about our chaser film? Let's talk about Wait Until Dark.
Yes.
Have you seen this before?
No, this was a first watch for me. You too?
How did we select it? Did I select this? I don't remember.
I honestly don't remember. It
just appeared on our list. It was meant to be.
Yeah.
What do we think of this? Psychological thriller. Audrey Hepburn plays a blind woman who is essentially terrorized by three criminals. 1967. What other details do you have about this one? Any sort of background you want to jump on this one?
It's notable because, like we've talked about a couple different times, including just right in this episode, is that it's an adaptation for the screen from a play.
Yes.
Not a novel this time, and not an original script, but it very much has a lot of similar feelings to Death Trap, which we mentioned, but it also it's yet again another kind of fun accident parallel. We began with a movie that had a female protagonist that is terrorized by men, and we end with one. And I don't think we had one in between, right? Like,
I think that you're right. Isn't that odd how that works?
Yeah, the existential thriller is not something that easily works with a female protagonist, at least in the eyes of the history of filmmaking.
Yeah, well, because you need a real protagonist for that. That's the reality of the situation.
But I kind of loved this movie.
Why did you love it? I struggled with it a lot just because the style felt very old to me.
It is a very old style. And the thing that made this movie go down in history, arguably, is the last 8 minutes of the movie.
Yes.
It takes place in almost complete darkness, which is kind of brazen and honestly experimental for 1960s cinema.
Sure.
They posted signs in movie theaters for people that bought tickets for the film saying, quote, "During the last 8 minutes of this picture, the theater will be darkened to the legal limit to heighten the terror of the breathtaking climax," which takes place in nearly total darkness on the screen. In those sections where smoking is permitted, those patrons are respectfully requested not to jar the effect by lighting up during the sequence.
Amazing. Different time.
And there's a little bit of that pranksterism, because Hitchcock did that too. He was known for, he would literally have pictures of himself tapping his watch saying no one's admitted after the first 10 minutes of the film, especially for Psycho and his other more successful efforts. So, it's interesting that we really haven't talked about that notion of almost the gimmick effect when it comes to thrillers. Sure. Because we talked a little bit about how scary something can be when we did a self-aware horror, but I maybe it's just me, because I had kind of bought into the film, plot holes abundant and everything, but it is specifically famous not just for that last 8 minute sequence, but for one particular jump scare.
Yeah,
you know which one I'm talking about?
Yeah, where the lunge.
Yes. So Alan Arkin
plays wonderful in this.
He's amazing.
He makes the movie.
Yeah. Without him, it would be terrible. Yeah. He is one of the terrorizers. Essentially, the conceit, right, is that because she's blind, she can't tell who's who. And so these guys have basically constructed multiple personas to try to create this fake experience about one guy who knows her husband, who's out on his job as a night photographer or whatever. And they're trying to manipulate her into revealing where this doll full of heroin is that somehow her husband wound up in possession of. Yeah, it's so contrived, right? But what makes it work is this, I think, cat and mouse between Audrey Hepburn and Alan Arkin, who's just batshit insane. And finally, I'd always enjoyed Alan Arkin. I think he relatively deserved that Little Miss Sunshine supporting Oscar. But he has always been a character actor, but he really gets to ham it up for the screen here with his weird bowl haircut and
The glasses.
Creepy smiling glasses.
Yeah.
And like compare and contrast that with Hepburn's very kind of mannered, old school kind of performance.
Yeah.
And it just plays off each other really well. And when that jump scare happens, like I watched this movie at 10 in the morning, but I still was jolted by it. It was really effective.
Yeah. It's funny you say that because I came across, it was either an interview or something, a book or something, about somebody seeing this film with a large group of people at like a camp or something with like a lot of like younger people. And this person was basically talking about how, everybody was like really engrossed in the film, but in that moment, the jump scare, like the entire, like 500 people or something, like just jumped out of their seats.
It's amazing.
And they're like, there's like, I'd never seen anything like this before in my life, which is so odd to me because I don't know. I just that feels dated to me, like the jump scare. Like it just it also feels like a play. Like it feels like a teleplay.
Yep.
It's like that essentially one location. So it also kind of works because it feels claustrophobic. And I think what's interesting. The one thing that did pop into my mind here is like, and you kind of just mentioned it, is something like a really fascinating, looking back on a historical viewpoint, is Arkin feels very late 60s. His vibe, his tone feels menacing, feels like that sort of Manson-esque killer. And Hepburn is just obviously a classic actress. And there is that weird conflict there of a change in society, how this sort of astute, very poised, polished woman is being terrorized by this kind of grimy, amoral freak, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
Now that I love that part, like that whole sort of conflict between those two is very, very interesting. What do we make of? From a thriller perspective, I think the film's quite successful, I would say. From the existential part of it, what do we think? What do you think's going on here? Is there a lot of meat on the bone?
There's not, admittedly, but there really wasn't. Just in general, I think for like genre work in this era of Hollywood, right?
Yeah.
I think it came up now that I'm kind of I'm digging back into my Chrome history to figure this out. I think I did.
Dangerous.
I am the culprit for putting it on our list, and it's because actually there's a couple different moments in the film now that I'm rereading this, having seen the film now, but like where you have to really think about the concept, not just literally, because that's very true in this film, but also metaphorically, of darkness, right? Mm-hmm. Like you said, this idea of amorality. Stephen King has Wait Until Dark, at least in 1981, he put out a book called Danse Macabre about non-book media representations of horror. And he called, at that moment in time anyways, Wait Until Dark the scariest movie of all time, saying that Alan Arkin's performance may be the greatest evocation of screen villainy ever.
Yeah.
And when it comes down to it, and I mean, even more so than the concept of self-awareness or postmodernism when we did horror films, we played fast and loose, right, with the concept of existentialism.
Oh, sure, yeah.
This cycle, and that's okay because it's a term that whose definition has, it's very much kind of changed over the years, especially in popular culture. The thing that really sticks with me, though, and I think this comes back to, because we wanted to, at least I wanted to start with Alex Garland's Men before I'd even seen it, is this real question, and I think we talked about this back on that episode, and maybe even a couple times after that too, especially with movies like The Game and Michael Clayton, the idea of figuring out who you are. And it's very much like kind of a throwaway detail about Audrey Hepburn's character in Wait Until Dark, but I think it's important to note that her character, she's not been blind since birth, right? she was blinded like a year prior to the story.
Yeah.
And there's a couple conversations she has, again, not a lot of meat on their bones, but enough to make it feel like this concept of darkness is not just something that is, been plaguing her whole life, but that has like, is a symbol of her own trauma. Right. Yeah. And in movies like The Game, like the suicide of his father, it's this haunting symbol of his own trauma that comes back to him over and over again.
Yeah.
And so existentialism is ultimately something that, the crisis is something that you have when you are trying to figure out who you are, especially in the face of constantly haunting trauma. And I feel like that's really powerful. And it's unfortunate that so much of the dialogue in the script has to do with, the machinations of this ridiculous set of manipulations. But I would love to see, like, I know there's been, like, on the style end of things, an attempt at that with, I'd imagine a lot of people would watch this movie and be like, oh yeah, this is like Don't Breathe or Panic Room. But what if we actually had someone kind of tackle this kind of character, this kind of duo of characters of the light and the dark, the blind and, the manipulator, nowadays? Like I would be excited to see something like that.
I think it's definitely due for like not a reboot, or a remake.
Wait Until Dark 2,
a requel. But I will say this: I did pick up on something, and kind of what you're talking about. There is a moment early on where I think she talks about the accident, and then there's a very sort of mansplaining moment where she's sort of like, "Well, I'll do anything for you," blah 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 blah. I think that's pointed in the sense that like she's helpless on some level. She doesn't have a lot of confidence anymore. She's dependent on Sam, on this man, right? Like she feels very diminished, right? And by the end, through the conflict, she doesn't feel as diminished. She's risen to the life or death moment and survived. And now she's a new person. Most of the movies we're talking about are about that. There is, person A at the beginning, thriller, and then person B comes out of that thriller, right? And almost every movie, Michael Clayton, The Hunt, Game, Insomnia dies. But The Crying Game, how he has to go through all of that in order to really understand love and commitment and stuff like that. It's,
but they're still damaged at the end, right?
Well, there's almost like two paths here, because you look at like Sorcerer, like House of Games, Insomnia, kind of not good endings for the characters, right? Killing of a Sacred Deer. How does Colin Farrell become a better person by not accidentally shooting his son? You know what I mean? Like, or Men, for that matter. Yeah. There's it doesn't necessarily work with all of them, but I think it is sort of a trope or pattern where what you're talking about in terms of existentialism, which is, trying to figure out who you are and what you are in the world. Oftentimes we don't broach that subject. We don't make that choice. The choice is thrust upon us through conflict. And I think that's, you see it in Wait Until Dark. You see it definitely in Crying Game and The Game, and certainly Michael Clayton in The Hunt. But I think that there's a broader sort of flow there that's happening, where I think the thriller is the catalyst for change in the character. It doesn't always happen that way. Like Sorcerer, I think of all the movies, trying to wrap this thing up in a bow for us, right?
Yeah.
But Sorcerer is the one that kind of sticks with you the most, because it feels in a way raw in an existential sense. Like when you're thinking about an existentialism in its pure form, like Camus started back in the day, Sorcerer feels like the most existential film. Yes. Because there's no way out. Right? Yeah. Ultimately, that was the message of a lot of existentialists. Yeah. There is no way out. And so what you do with what you have and the time that you have is very important. And that's the richness of life. Even if it means, taking some crazy job to drive dynamite across, South America, right? Like, but there's a victory in him at what Roy Scheider does at the end. He wins, right? And even though he gets shot at the end of the movie and he dies, whatever, but he still did that, and that's the thing that matters. And I think, I don't know, it's funny to kind of look at these films that way and see who comes out with a sort of existential win. You know what I mean? Right.
And I mean, it's interesting that we are able to wrap that up with Wait Until Dark, but with Frenzy, like that's why that movie feels so empty, right?
Yeah.
Is because we lose that, and maybe that's once again purposeful. It's pranksterism on Hitchcock's part, but it really feels like a half-hearted effort into that journey. It's interesting you bring up Sorcerer because, like, I'm looking back and I feel I love that movie, and I think it's probably my second favorite of the one that we did this cycle.
Yeah.
But I have been haunted by it since I first saw it in the movie theaters. But the ending of Michael Clayton, getting in the cab, right, and saying "just drive," and it's also like. What's similar is that it's that admittance that there is no way out, right?
There's no way out. Yeah.
But the one thing, kind of like with the dynamite, the choice to traverse that, he didn't make that choice. And that's why, once again, I don't want to, I know a joke said twice is just going to kill it. But with the new, hopefully soon to be in production, Henry Clayton, we can be brought into the world of passing that legacy down, right? Of if it was too late for us, it doesn't have to be too late for our sons.
Yeah, maybe that's spoken from a father, and someone who doesn't have a child. I have a different viewpoint of that.
Yeah.
But no, it's been a great, interesting series and cycle. I think it's an odd one because there's a lot of different paths that you can take with a thriller, and some of them end in awfulness, and some of them end with some sort of triumph, even if it's fleeting. But in every single one, there's just a grand transformation that happens, and that's what makes these movies exciting. That's what makes them interesting and engaging. Is that the protagonist does actually change, right? Something does happen. Any other closing thoughts for us?
No, I mean, when we did Self-Aware Horror, I kind of looked back at the end of that finale and deeper into film history, because obviously it doesn't end with 1967, doesn't begin there either. But we had kind of a crossover. We did an episode, we don't think we mentioned it on this show. We did a special Patreon episode for our friends over at Spoiler Piece Theater regarding Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, which came out in 1962. And very much fits both the existential thriller template as well as the self-aware horror one. Absolute classic. If you haven't caught us on that episode, seek it out. It's a fun conversation with Evan and his co-host there on Spoiler Piece Theater. 1962 was also the year that Cape Fear and Manchurian Candidate came out, two thrillers that definitely could argue existentialism on both the domestic and political sides. And then further back, 1957, courtroom dramas got pretty existential with Witness for the Prosecution and 12 Angry Men. 1952, more kind of spy espionage thriller, The Atomic City. Noir, I think one of its most existential zeniths is Out of the Past, 1947. I know we're both fans of that one. And then to make another connection to Paul Schrader, he remade Cat People, which came out in 1942, which very much, once again, kind of crosses over. That's the movie that instigated the term male gaze in film academia, and is arguably just as much a thriller as it is a horror film, because it's very psychological in nature. But definitely seek out the original black and white version from 1942, not Schrader's problematic opus from the 1980s.
Yeah, it's not very good. Shall we tease a possible? What are we doing for the next cycle, Chris? Should we like hash it out right now?
Sure. We've been going back and forth, Dan and I, with spreadsheets and emails and charts, and we want to do something regarding the idea of action and comedy.
Yes.
Because
which
Bullet
is different
Train,
than an adventure comedy. We will figure it out soon enough.
We'll figure it out.
But yeah, we will be back. We appreciate you all listening. This has been Film Tricks.